Hello, my name is Sean Briscoe, and this presentation is an introduction to the stock issues of policy debate. It's a look or a glimpse into the traditional theory behind this format of debate. Now, one of the things that I'm fond of telling my students is that there is really only one rule of debate, specifically one rule of policy debate, and that's that there are no rules. You can actually do anything, say anything, turn the debate into anything you want as long as you can do so in a persuasive manner, and you can out-debate your opponents on why debate should look that particular way. That being said, although there is only one rule, there are several guidelines that help us to understand how to approach debate. There are a number of tactics which debaters can use to be more successful. There are certain strategies that debaters use. We have structures which help us to understand arguments. There are different approaches to presenting your material in a debate. There are different approaches to the way that judges view debate. There are different styles in terms of how we present our material. There are a lot of building blocks that help us to really make policy debate what it is, or make debate whatever it is that students want to make debate. As a former runner, I like to think of debate as something like track and field. It's a really simple activity. In track and field, it's really easy to say, hey, go out and run faster than everybody else and you'll win. And a lot of people, I think, are tempted to say the same thing about debate. Hey, go out and be more effective at talking than your opponents and you will win. But the reality is there's a lot more to it than just going out and running if this is track. Right? There are a number of different things involved in being a competitive runner. How do you start the race? Do you stand up? Do you lean over? Do you crouch down into a sprinter start? How do you approach the first turn of the race? Do you run on the inside, on the outside? How quickly do you go during that first turn? How do you pace yourself? I was a long distance runner myself, so how do you pace yourself over the course of that entire race? If you go out too fast, then you're going to burn out before you get to the end. If you don't go out fast enough, you run the risk of falling too far behind the other competitors, or having too much energy and not running or not taking advantage of your max potential. When do you start your kick? When do you start that final sprint? If you start too soon, you might die before you get to the finish line. If you wait too late, you're not going to catch up to the runners you need to catch up to, or you're not going to run as fast as you could. There's a lot of training involved. You incorporate endurance training and speed work. You might incorporate some limited amount of weight training as well. How you eat impacts how effective you are as a runner, or how good of a runner you are. Do you engage in cross training? There's a whole lot that goes into being a successful runner. And the same thing is true about speech and debate, or about debate. Although it's pretty simple, go out and out-argue your opponents, there's a lot of stuff that you can take advantage of to make yourself a more effective debater. And one of the things that I think is the beauty of policy debate is that as a format, it has fewer restrictions than any other format of debate. Debaters are allowed to create what the debate should look like. You can turn it into something new. One of the unique things of policy debate is that over the decades, we've added new types of arguments, new types of approaches and presentation styles to make it a more complete, a more student-centered activity. There really are very few restrictions in terms of what debaters are allowed to do. It's also, I think, the most balanced format in that both the affirmative and the negative have a pretty equal opportunity to win the debate. And when you look at some of the other formats of debate, that's not necessarily true. But there's also time to create. Both sides of the debate have 4 speeches. Each speaker has 2 speeches. You have 8-minute constructives and 5-minute rebuttals. That gives the debaters a lot of opportunity to explore their ideas and to experiment with new strategies so that we can actually change what debate looks like. And in my opinion, change is not necessarily good, it's not necessarily bad, it's just different. But overall, the more that we get students creating, the more we get them injecting themselves into the debate, the better the learning environment is, and ultimately the more fun the activity is too. So my goal today then is to introduce you to some of those guidelines, some of those basic foundations of policy debate, so that you can truly understand where policy debate comes from and use that as a building block for other types of argumentation which you will be exposed to later on in your debate career. So the first thing we need to look at are the three basic guidelines that drive policy debate. The first guideline is that the affirmative has a single burden, and that is to support the resolution. Okay, we have a national policy debate topic which lasts for the entire school year. Within that debate topic, it's a pretty broad topic, and so within that topic, students have the opportunity and the freedom to choose what particular policy they want to advocate as they support the resolution. The negative has a burden as well, and that's that they have to refute the affirmative. Notice that I didn't necessarily say that they have to refute the resolution. I would say traditionally it was almost always the case that the negative team refuted the resolution, but the real burden is that the negative has to disagree with the affirmative and argue against the affirmative. The third guideline is that there are a set number of speeches with predetermined times, and those speeches take place in a preset order. So we start off with an 8-minute speech, which is the first affirmative constructive, and that's where you introduce us to the arguments that the affirmative team is going to run in the debate. After that constructive speech, there is a cross-examination period that's 3 minutes in length, where the second negative speaker asks questions of the first affirmative speaker. Now, cross-examination is not an opportunity for you to argue with your opponent. You're not really trying to lay the smack down, so to speak. It's an opportunity for you to seek clarification. Try and figure out what it is that you missed, or what it is that you maybe misunderstood, or that you just weren't clear about. What you want to use cross-examination for is to really identify what your opponents were saying, because you cannot argue against something that you don't know what it was that they said, right? So you use that cross-examination period to figure out what were they saying. Following that cross-examination period, we have another 8-minute speech, and that's given by the first negative speaker, so it's the first negative constructive. Most of that speech, usually about 6 minutes of that speech, is comprised of running negative offensive arguments to reject the resolution or the affirmative plan, so they're constructing their own offense in the round. And typically about 2 minutes of that speech is spent deconstructing the arguments put forth by the first affirmative constructive. After that speech, there's a cross-examination period where the first affirmative speaker asks questions of the first negative. Again, it's time for clarification. Then we have the second affirmative constructive. Again, it's an 8-minute speech. The second affirmative constructive needs to deconstruct the offensive arguments put forth by the 1NC, but also rebuild the arguments of the 1AC. Then we have a cross-examination period. The first negative speaker will ask questions for 3 minutes of the second affirmative. Then we have the second negative constructive. Again, it's an 8-minute speech, and the second negative speaker is going to rebuild the offensive arguments of the 1NC, again, re-attack the affirmative case, and so forth. Following that, there's a cross-examination period. The second affirmative speaker will ask questions of the 2N. Okay, I want to talk just briefly about cross-examination and the pattern that's set forth. Because a lot of new debaters tend to forget who's supposed to be answering or asking questions. They don't usually forget who's supposed to answer it because it's whoever just spoke. So you can see after the first affirmative constructive, the first affirmative speaker answers questions. After the first negative constructive, the first negative speaker answers question, and so forth. But who does the asking? To help you figure out who's supposed to ask the questions, it's the person who does not speak next. So you can see after the 1AC, the next speech is the first negative constructive. So the 1N does not want to spend time asking questions of the 1A. She wants to prep for her speech. So her partner, the 2N, will be asking the questions. Same after the 1NC, the 2AC is going to be giving the next speech, so the first affirmative speaker is going to ask those questions. Okay, so we go through our first 4 speeches, the constructive speeches. Then we have a shift where the negative is going to have another speech. So after the second negative constructive and the corresponding cross-examination period, there will be the first negative rebuttal, which is a 5-minute speech. We refer to the 2NC and the 1NR as the negative block. It's a single speech of 13 minutes given by two separate people. So what does that mean for you as a debater? It means that the 1N should never, the 1NR, should never repeat the 2NC. You want to divide the arguments up that are in the debate round and press forward from there. So let's say that the affirmative has identified a problem. They've also identified a solution. So that's two big arguments put forth in the 1AC, a problem and a solution. Let's say the negative team ran one offensive argument, a disadvantage. They said that if you pass that proposal, then there's going to be a corresponding negative consequence. They also run an argument called topicality, which we'll talk about in a little bit, where they say that the proposal put forth by the 1AC does not fall within the boundaries established by this year's debate topic. So there's four big arguments in the round: a problem, a solution, an unintended consequence, also called a disadvantage, and a topicality argument. The 2NC is probably going to take two of those arguments, and the 1NR will probably take the other two arguments. That way, you do not run the risk of the 2NC and the 1NR simply repeating one another. You divide up the issues and press forward. Now, after the 1NR, we have the first affirmative rebuttal. That's a 5-minute speech where you have to answer 13 minutes of negative speech time. So that's a very difficult speech to give. The 1AR really needs to zero in on the most critical aspect of each and every argument and really hammer that point home. After the 1AR, we have the second negative rebuttal, which is a 5-minute speech, and then we finish up with the 2AR, or the second affirmative rebuttal, which is also a 5-minute speech. Now, the 2NR and the 2AR are a bit different than all of the preceding speeches. In the first 6 speeches, we were building the foundations of arguments. Actually, that was the 1AC and the 1NC. We build the foundation for arguments. And then from the 2AC through the 1AR, we're deconstructing our opponent's ideas, we're rebuilding our own ideas, and so forth. In the 2NR and the 2AR, there is going to be some clash. There's certainly going to be some rebuilding and some deconstruction and that sort of thing. But the primary purpose of the 2NR and the 2AR are to frame the debate. The purpose of those two speeches is to look at all of the issues in the round, all of the arguments, and assign priorities to those arguments for the judge. Highlight what's important and why it's important. I do also want to take just a little bit of time to talk about the difference between constructive speeches and rebuttal speeches. There's basically two main differences. One is obvious. It's the time length. You have 8-minute speech versus a 5-minute speech. The second main difference between those speeches is that in the rebuttal speeches, we have a phrase where we say, no new arguments in rebuttal. Now that does not mean that you are limited to simply repeating the things that you said earlier in the debate. Quite simply, that would be boring. Okay? What we mean when we say no new arguments is that you cannot shift the debate into a new direction. You cannot say, oh, I totally misunderstood, I didn't get that, or you're absolutely right, I'm going to answer your argument in this direction now. Okay, you can't do that. It is okay to say, I say this, you have a response, well that doesn't answer my response because of this, or you weren't taking into consideration that. Okay, yeah, that's something new in the rebuttals, but it's an extension of a previous idea, and that's okay. So those are your speeches, the time limits, and the order in which those speeches occur. We also have preparation time. Depending on the tournament that you're at, you typically have somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes of preparation time. The St. Louis Urban Debate League, for example, gives 5 minutes of preparation time to its debate teams. So the affirmative team has 5 minutes and the negative team has 5 minutes. That's essentially like calling a timeout in an athletic event. But unlike an athletic event where you have a certain number of timeouts that have a set time for that timeout, you get to pretty much use your prep time however you want. So if I was on the negative, for example, I might take 35 seconds before the 1NC, and then I might take 4 minutes before the 2NC, and that would leave me 25 seconds to use before the 2NR. Okay, I can divide up that time however I want. Now, one of the norms of the activity is that you are only allowed to take prep time immediately before your team is about to speak. Okay, so if I'm on the negative again, I could take prep time before the 1 in C, before the 2 in C, before the 1 in R, although you shouldn't, and before the 2 in R. Okay, those are the times that I could take prep time, and you aren't really usually allowed to take prep time in the middle of a speech. Okay, I just made one offside comment about you should never take prep time before the 1 in R. Why is that? Well, if you remember back to my description of the negative block, you're dividing up the arguments between the 2 in C and the 1 in R. So the 1 in R does not have to listen to the 2 in C. If the 2 in C takes 4 minutes of prep time, that's 4 minutes of prep time for the 1 in R. During the 2 in C's speech, that's 8 more minutes of prep time for the 1 in R. And during cross-examination of the 2 in, that's another 3 minutes of prep time for the 1 in R. That means you have a lot of preparation time to get ready, and you should never need to call additional prep time. Okay. Now, I said these are the 3 basic guidelines of policy debate. The affirmative has to support the resolution, the negative has to refute the affirmative, and there are a set number of speeches with predetermined times in a specific order. All 3 of those are guidelines. I have seen each and every one of those guidelines broken, and the team that broke those guidelines still won the debate. Okay? You truly can do anything in debate as long as you can convince your judge that it's a good idea. Now, I will tell you, I will caution you, there are a number of traditional judges out there who believe that these 3 guidelines are steadfast rules that cannot be broken. So you have to be careful about when you decide to deviate from one of these guidelines. Okay, policy debate in a nutshell comes down to 2 basic questions. The first, is the affirmative plan necessary? Is there a need to do something? Second, do the benefits of the plan outweigh its disadvantages? Or do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages? If the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, then the judge votes for the affirmative. If the bad outweighs the good, then the judge would vote for the negative. Now, both of these 2 questions have 2 sub-questions. In the first, is the affirmative plan necessary? We also ask ourselves, what is the problem? What is the bad thing that's happening in the world? If you want to convince your judge that we need a plan, that we need to do something, you need to identify a reason for it. And that requires you to identify something bad that's happening right now, or something bad that's about to happen if we don't change course. But second, you also need to identify the cause of the problem. Why does that problem exist? That question is primarily important because it helps us to determine what the solution is going to be. Okay, so once you identify whether or not a plan is necessary, you actually then tell the judge what that plan is, what that proposal is, and then we evaluate the question of, do the advantages of the plan outweigh its disadvantages? And there are some sub-questions for that. First, will the proposal actually work? Will it fix the problem? Or will it at least reduce the harm or the bad thing that we see in the present system? Okay, you don't have to solve 100%. You just have to show that some good will come of the affirmative plan. Because if we leave the world better off, then a rational person would choose to pass that policy, would choose to implement that solution. But there are some additional questions, sub-questions to ask, like what are the additional consequences? There are a number of additional consequences associated with any decision you'll ever make in your life, right? There can be some additional good consequences, some additional benefits, but there can also be unintended consequences, the bad things that come up when we choose to do something. Excuse me. And so the negative will find opportunity or find opportunities to show what the unintended consequences of passing a policy might be. And they call those disadvantages. There are also potentially opportunity costs, that if we implement the affirmative proposal, we lose the opportunity to do something else, which is actually a better idea. Okay, there's a trade-off between 2 alternative ideas. In the world of policy debate, that would be known as the negative team running a counterplan or a counter-proposal, which I'll talk about at a future time, not in today's presentation though. All right. Then we need to look at the 2 types of arguments. So on the previous slide, we talked about the 2 main questions of policy debate. But because because all rules in debate are debatable, we actually end up with two different types of arguments. One is a procedural argument. That's where you start debating the rules of the game. What are the rules of the game? Why do those rules exist? What are the parameters of the game or the activity of policy debate? And you can actually construct arguments to say, this is a rule that exists, the other team violated that rule, and they should therefore lose the game. Okay? But you can also run procedural arguments that say, that might be a traditionally accepted rule, but it shouldn't be considered a rule anymore. You could run something that says, here's a new rule that we need in policy debate, and why. And because our opponents didn't follow that good idea, that good rule, they should lose. Okay? But then there are substantive arguments. And that's where you present arguments showing why a policy proposal ought to be implemented or not implemented. What is the good or the bad that stems from that specific policy? Before talking about the specific stock issues, there are some other important terms that you ought to be familiar with. One is the concept of fiat. Fiat is a concept that says we will pretend that if the affirmative team demonstrates that the plan is a good idea, then the judge would vote for that plan, and we would, in essence, pretend that that judge's ballot is a U.S. federal government decision to enact a piece of legislation. So in other words, it's Congress passing the legislation and the president signing off on it, or possibly a two-thirds override. Okay? But we don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of examining who will implement this policy, will they actually generate the political support to pass the policy, and those types of things. We can assume through the power of fiat that the plan will go into effect. And that enables us to really evaluate the effects of policies, the effects of proposed solutions, rather than having to examine the political realities of the idea. So it allows us to really get at the intricacies of that policy and the benefits of that policy. There's also an idea of presumption. Presumption is a concept that says, who would we, well, some people look at it as who would we default to in the event of a tie? If I cannot make a decision between the affirmative and negative, how would I vote? And a judge then would use presumption to determine who should win. Now, in traditional debate land, we used the judicial model of debate where we presumed that the status quo was innocent, just like a defendant in a criminal court case is presumed innocent. And therefore, the status quo, or the negative team, has presumption. They're presumed innocent until proven guilty by the affirmative. And the affirmative has to create a powerful case to show why the status quo is guilty, and they use the stock issues to do that. Now, somewhere in the 1970s, the 1960s, 1980s, things began to shift to policy models of debate, and this idea of presumption resting with the status quo kind of shifted. As we moved more and more into the legislative model of debate and policy analysis, we started just saying we evaluate rounds based on cost-benefit analysis. Does the plan lead to more good than bad or more bad than good? And since the affirmative team really has the first speech, most contemporary judges actually say, hey, as long as you've met your basic prima facie a priori burdens, then we can say, sure, we should vote for the affirmative because we can presume that some amount of good is going to come from the plan until the negative runs their offensive arguments. So there was a shift over time that presumption moved away from the negative team and actually towards the affirmative. That idea of a prima facie burden a priori is that the affirmative team needs to present a prima facie case out of the gate. Okay, you need to meet each of the 5 stock issues, which is what we're going to talk about next, in order to demonstrate your minimum burdens out of the 1AC. So let's talk about those stock issues. Okay, there are 5 of them, and a stock issue is basically like NASCAR is called stock car racing, basically meaning that all of the cars are more or less the same, so that you're really testing the skills of the driver and their crew chiefs, right? But all of the cars are basically the same. It's stock. It's a core element. It's a foundational element, and all of them are the same. Excuse me. And so every affirmative case really ought to present these 5 stock issues. The first 2 are significance and harms, and that's where you're identifying a bad thing that's happening in the world. The harm is the actual bad thing. The significance is usually evaluated through numbers. How many people is that affecting? So for example, if we were talking about people dying, the harm would be death. The significance would be how many people are dying. Okay. The bottom line, though, is that once upon a time, affirmative teams really had to demonstrate both of those, a quantitative harm, significance, and a qualitative harm, the harm itself. But more or less, in today's debate world, we just say, as long as the affirmative is demonstrating some sort of a problem that seems to be significant, that's good enough. And one of the ways that we've done that is, if you're evaluating things like death, you can't really put a price on a certain number of lives that matter, right? Every life matters. And so if I'm saving one life, or if one person is going to die in the status quo, that is significant. Okay. The third stock issue is inherency. All inherency really is it's the cause of the problem. Why does that problem exist in the first place? If you can identify that cause, then you can press forward with identifying a proposal. And that brings us to the fourth stock issue, topicality. Topicality is really just like the word sounds. Does the proposal put forth by the affirmative fall within the boundary established by this year's debate topic, or this year's debate resolution? Does the plan fall within the topic area? And then finally, the affirmative case in the 1AC needs to demonstrate solvency, that they can actually have a topical plan that overcomes the cause to reduce the problem and make it better. Let's go back to those two basic questions then. Is the plan necessary? That question is really answered with significance, harms, and inherency. With significance and harms, you're identifying the problem, and with inherency, you're identifying the cause. The second basic question, do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages? Does the good outweigh the bad? This is where you evaluate solvency. Does the plan actually work? Are there additional advantages which may come into play? Maybe there's economic advantages, maybe there's impacts on American leadership in the world, maybe there's environmental benefits. There's a lot of additional advantages which could come into play. And then, of course, there are unintended consequences, the disadvantages which the negative might run. There are counterplans where they might present alternate solutions, and so forth. All of those answer that second question of, do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages? So, let's look at those stock issues with an example. If we had a debate topic that said, resolve, the United States federal government should establish a national safety traffic law to improve the safety of the nation's highways, or improve safety on the nation's highways, we could use those stock issues to evaluate that debate topic. This is really just a chart that shows you the problem solution that I described earlier with those two basic questions. We have the problem on one side, the bad thing happening and the cause of it, and on the other side we're looking at the solution itself. Does it work? And what are the additional consequences? Same slide, just turning them from individual words into questions. Okay, let's talk about the topic then. Should the U.S. federal government establish a national traffic safety law? Well, we might have a proposal to implement a nationwide speed limit of 55 miles per hour. Arguably, that falls within that debate topic. Federal government sets a common speed limit standard. Now, let's evaluate that proposal through those two problem solution questions. Does a problem exist? Well, what's causing the problem? That's the inherency side of things, the cause of the problem. In the present system, or the status quo, the states establish their own speed limits. And so one state might have a speed limit of 55 miles per hour on the highway, while another has 60, another 65, another 70, another 75, and another 85. Okay, various states have different speed limits. Is there a harm? Well, we could look at that and talk about how high-speed accidents increase the likelihood of death. Okay, and there are a number of things that we could talk about. If you live on borders where different states have different speed limits. Say Wyoming and Montana have very different speed limits. There's a huge difference from one state to the next. Or maybe you're on the East Coast where you're constantly driving across borders, and so speed limits are constantly changing. And when you have people driving at different speeds, you increase the risk of an accident, and the faster you're going, the more damage you're going to have, right? So there's a couple of problems that we see. One, you're more likely to have accidents because of the inconsistent speed limits, but also the faster you're going, the more dangerous the situation. Is the problem significant? You would evaluate that by bringing in statistics showing how many people die every year on the highways. Then you've answered that first question in the 1AC. Does a problem exist? Now we would propose our solution, implement a nationwide speed limit, and then we would evaluate that through the lens of solvency. Does the proposal actually work? Will change reduce the harm? And we could say that plan decreases death by having a common driving standard or speed limit standard and also lowering driving speeds. All right, so we actually fix the problem in two ways. One, we no longer are inconsistent between states. And second, because instead of driving at 80 miles an hour, everybody's going 55. The lower speed limit means that if you do get into an accident, that accident is going to be less severe. Now, finally, the second sub-question of is change desirable? Do the benefits outweigh the costs? Well, part of that question is answered simply by looking at solvency. Do you actually save lives through your plan? Now, it's important to point out that you don't necessarily have to save all lives. Just because you cited, say, 200,000 people die on the highways every year doesn't mean that your plan has to eliminate all death on the highways. You just have to show that you do, in fact, save some lives. Excuse me. You might also have some economics arguments. The affirmative might say cars are more efficient at 55 miles per hour, therefore you're burning less gasoline. That means individuals are spending less money on gas. That means they have more money to spend on groceries, food, clothing, shelter, whatever. They have money to spend on other things, to include even just recreation time, leisure time, spending time with their friends. You could also say that there's an economic benefit that the faster we travel on our highways, the more wear and tear there is on the roads, which means we spend a lot of taxpayer dollars needlessly on road construction. The negative, on the other hand, might push back, though, and say, but if you do that, then construction workers lose jobs, and that's an economic choice or an economic benefit we don't want to lose. The affirmative might also bring in environmental arguments. They might say that since cars are more efficient at 55 miles per hour, we burn less fuel, which means we're emitting less pollution into the atmosphere, which means we have less low-level air pollution, less asthma, less cancerous materials in the air, whatever, less smog. So we have different environmental benefits as well. The negative might also bring up some arguments of choice, specifically in terms of states' rights and federalism. The idea that certain powers are reserved for the states. One of the things that we've left to the states is control over the highways, to regulate the highways how they see fit, and this proposal that the affirmative has is the federal government or the national government reaching into the purview of states and taking that power away and saying you can no longer have control and authority over your highways. And what are the negative repercussions of that? So that's where you start to evaluate that bigger, broader question of, do the benefits outweigh the costs? That is a basic debate round, or what a debate round might look like. But let's look at each of the stock issues in a little bit more detail. First, like I said before, significance and harms. From the affirmative perspective, all you really have to do is identify a problem, and usually you do that through two means, both quantitative, numbers, and qualitative, what the harm looks like. What's the bad thing we're actually talking about? But like I said, you don't necessarily have to identify numbers, because even just identifying death is in and of itself a significant harm. From the negative perspective, there are a couple of things you can do. The easiest is to diminish the attack, to reduce the amount of harm that our opponents are showing. So if, for example, they're pointing out that there are 100,000 homeless people, you might say, no, there are only 50,000 homeless people. That won't win you the round, because that's still a problem that exists. But by diminishing the claim of the affirmative, you make it easier for your offensive arguments to win later on in the debate. The negative might also choose to deny the attack, say that that harm doesn't exist at all. Now, that's very difficult to prove in a debate round because most affirmatives are going to pick something that is at least somewhat agreed upon to be a bad thing that everyone can see. So it's very hard to deny the harm story completely. But it is absolutely a possibility. You can also present case turns to the debate. Actually have an offensive argument showing that instead of that the bad thing that you're trying to identify is actually a good thing. That would be a case turn. So let's look at the diminish, deny, and case turns a little bit. Let's say that the affirmative team has run a case with a harm story of global warming. Maybe one of the scenarios of their case is sea level rise, that we're going to have sea levels rise by 3 meters within the next 20 years. You might diminish that attack by saying, no, sea levels will only rise by 1.5 meters, and instead of happening over a 20-year span, it's going to be over a 30-year span. Now that's important because there won't be nearly as much harm done when the sea levels rise only half the amount that the affirmative has claimed, and also since it's taking longer to rise, there's more time for us to adapt to the sea level rise, right? So that's to diminish the attack. Now, if you just end the debate right there, though, the affirmative's going to win because they still get benefit. You could deny the attack by saying global warming doesn't exist, that human beings are not causing the problem, or that the global warming theory is flawed or whatever. You could run a case turn which says global warming isn't harmful, it's actually beneficial. That when you increase temperatures, you have a warmer planet with more carbon dioxide, and that increases transpiration rates. We actually have more vegetation growth and so forth, and so global warming would actually be a good thing. That's an example of a case turn. As you can see, each one of those is actually going to become, as you step down from diminish to deny to case turns, each one is actually getting harder to prove, but each one, if won, is more useful to the negative. The last option for the negative is to dismiss or disbar the attack, and essentially, in that instance, what you're usually doing is saying, yeah, that problem exists, but we let it exist because of something else. There's a good reason that we ignore that problem. And typically, it's really just an opportunity for you to present your own offensive argument against the harm story presented by the affirmative. That's really an unintended consequence, and we'll talk about disadvantages at a later date. Okay, the cause of the problem. From the affirmative perspective, there are 4 basic ways that you can identify the cause of the problem. You could show that there are structural causes of the problem, that we have laws in place which actually are creating a situation which has established a harm or caused a harm. So, for example, maybe if we're talking about homelessness, we might say that the cause of the problem is a lack of low-income housing for homeless, and one of the structures that's in place is maybe city zoning laws, that we do not have zoning laws prohibit the construction of low-income housing. That would be a structural barrier. You could have attitudinal causes, that people just don't want to tackle that issue. They don't believe that it's a serious problem. They don't believe that it's something that the government should try and fix. And so that's why the cause exists. Or maybe you might even just show that the attitude is that human beings are addicted to our bottled water. We want our bottled water. We want to be able to buy it, and so therefore we're constantly buying these water bottles, and then that fills up landfills, the plastic bottles work their way into the ocean or whatever. Right? It's attitudes of the people. We just don't care, we're not concerned about it, whatever. You could have gap inherency, which is kind of the opposite of a structural problem. Instead of a structure causing the problem, it's a lack of something. We don't actually have a policy in place to do X. Right? We have not provided vouchers to low-income families to use on rent or mortgages or whatever. And then existential is the weakest cause or way to demonstrate a cause, which is simply showing that the problem exists and we therefore we must not be doing something about it, right? It's the weakest way to demonstrate the cause of the problem, but it is, at least for some judges, an acceptable form of demonstrating the cause. From the negative's perspective, you very rarely, if ever, want to refute inherency, or the cause of the problem. I've heard some people, including myself back when I was a debater, say things like, inherency is a stupid argument. Well, to some extent that's true, but there's actually some nuance that I think gets lost by a lot of people. The reason why it's not generally a good idea for you to run an inherency argument is because it's very rare for affirmative teams to choose a policy which hasn't, or that has already been enacted by the government, right? There might be a similar policy out there, but their exact policy hasn't been done. And so if they can show that their exact policy hasn't been done, then there's still a reason for implementing the affirmative policy, because it's a little bit different. But if you do run that type of the similar program exists, you actually undermine some of your own offensive arguments. So if you're going to run an unintended consequence, a disadvantage elsewhere in the debate, to say that if you pass a policy like yours, it's going to trigger this backlash, or it's going to cause this bad thing to happen, but over on their affirmative case you said that we were already doing something like their plan, then your disadvantage is already going to happen in the status quo, so they might as well vote for the affirmative, or have the judge vote for the affirmative, so that we can get additional benefits, right? That's why you very rarely refute the negative. So the rule of thumb is, unless you have a card or piece of evidence that specifically states that the affirmative plan is being done right now, you probably ought to just ignore inherency. At higher levels of debate, there are actually some other really good inherency arguments that you can run, but as a general rule of thumb for beginning debaters, unless you have a piece of evidence saying that that exact plan is being done now, I would not bother to argue against inherency. Okay, topicality. The fourth stock issue. Topicality focuses the debate on a specific policy discussion, and so the affirmative plan is limited by the debate topic or the resolution. They're not limited to talking about harms that are quote-unquote topical harms. Just because the resolution is related to the oceans doesn't mean that they can't claim economic benefits. It doesn't mean that they can't claim benefits from scientific advancement or U.S. leadership in the world, right? Those are all effects that stem from the decision to implement a specific piece of legislation or a plan. But they are limited to a proposal which falls within the boundaries of the debate topic. All of that just means that debate actually becomes more debatable, because we have a general sense of what the policy is without having to get into a lot of the specifics. It also allows us to foster real-world policy analysis by debating these concepts or the types of policies which might go into effect. I already said all that. It's a separate and distinct stock issue from things like harms and inherency and whatnot. And you're only looking at the plan text itself. Is the proposal put forth by the affirmative team a topical action? Does it fall within the boundaries established by the resolution or the debate topic? Now, I like to think of topicality as an amoeba. You have this squiggly line, which the resolution has set parameters for the debate. And all of those little black dots are possible plans which the affirmative team might run. The dots inside that amoeba then are topical actions. The ones on the outside are non-topical actions. Those are things that affirmative teams are not allowed to run, right, under the stock issue of topicality. Now, one of the reasons why I like to think of topicality as an amoeba is because the negative and the affirmative can have debates about what the different words in the resolution mean. So the boundaries established by the resolution in one round might not look the same as they do in the next round. And so you can have debate back and forth to decide whether or not a specific action is actually topical or not. So some of those dots that are in the middle will probably never run the risk of being considered non-topical, but some of those out near the edge of the periphery of the topic may, in the next round, be determined to be outside the debate topic. The basic gist of why topicality exists I guess my language has changed a little bit over the years. I put division of ground, abuse, and jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is really just referring to the idea of it's a rule of the game. Topicality is a rule of the game, and so therefore the affirmative has to provide a topical plan. But I would say that most judges in today's world do not really think that just because it's a rule matters. They want to know why that rule exists. And so really then the models of topicality today come down to either fairness or education. From the fairness perspective, it's that debate is a game and both the affirmative and the negative should have an equal opportunity to win. And so we have a debate topic to ensure that both teams have fair access to the ballot or a fair chance to win. Education, as a model of topicality, says that this is first and foremost an academic activity. And in order for us to get academic benefit, there needs to be predictability to the debate topic. We need to have an idea of what it is that we're going to discuss so that we can all do research and be prepared to meet one another. Ultimately then, fairness and education are probably the two primary reasons for why topicality matters in the debate. You'll also notice this is the first stock issue which is considered a negative side stock issue. All of the other stock issues are really ideas or concepts used by the affirmative to establish a case. Topicality, while the affirmative has to provide a topical plan, it really is generally presented as a negative argument to show why the affirmative team should lose. They ran a case which is outside the debate topic, so they should lose. So how does the affirmative then answer a topicality argument that the negative team runs? Well, first of all, the negative team had some sort of an interpretation. They said, here, this is a word in the resolution which you don't meet. This is the definition of that word. This is how the resolution is meant to be interpreted. Well, you could simply say, yeah, and we meet that interpretation. Our case falls within the parameters that you established. Alternatively, or in addition to, the affirmative might offer their own counter-interpretation by saying that your interpretation, we have a different interpretation which is actually better than yours. Third, they could argue that the negative interpretation is actually flawed in some way, that the negative team misunderstood something. Or fourth, they could argue that topicality should not be a voting issue, that they should not lose the round on topicality. Okay? None of those four responses are mutually exclusive, by the way. The affirmative can actually say, we meet your flawed interpretation, and therefore we also provide you a counter-interpretation, and even if we lose all of that, topicality is not a voting issue anyway. Right? So you could do all four of those in a round. And then finally, the stock issue of solvency. From the affirmative perspective, you simply want to show that you can overcome the cause of the problem and demonstrate that you reduce the bad thing in the world. You make the world a better place. From the negative perspective, you can mitigate that solvency, show that you do less good than you claim. Your plan won't solve 100%. But again, remember, a mitigator, like on harms, is not going to actually win the round for the negative, right? It's at the end of the day, if you simply mitigate the solvency story of the affirmative is still getting something good out of their plan. But a mitigator, or reducing the amount of benefit of the plan, is still a good idea because it gives your offensive arguments greater persuasiveness later on in the debate. You can also run absolute solvency takeouts, that your plan will not work 100%. The technology is flawed, it simply will not work. You cannot do this, the resources don't exist to make it happen, whatever. You can have various different arguments showing that your plan will not work at all. You get 0% solvency. Again, that's a very effective strategy, but is a lot harder than mitigating. And then finally, you could have a case turn, similar to a case turn on the harm story, except in this particular case, you say that you actually make the problem worse, not better. Right? So whatever your proposed solution is actually going to make things worse. Let me use a controversial but recent example. Federal government, city governments, state governments all look at inner cities and say that crime is rampant. There's a lot of crime in the cities. We have drug crime, gang-related crime, whatever, and we need to fix that problem. And so as the U.S. military has finished using various weapons, weapon systems, personnel carriers, and that sort of things, the federal government transferred those items to police forces. And so we had the militarization of the police force. So the plan was to transfer those goods and that equipment to police forces in order to address the harm of gang violence, drug violence, what have you. But you could have a case turn saying that the militarization of the police force creates an even bigger problem because it sets up in the mind of, because law enforcement and military personnel have different missions, right? Law enforcement exist to protect and serve the local population. Armed forces exist to move out into the world and project American power to change things outside the boundaries or outside the borders of the United States, right? There's two completely different missions, but by transferring that military hardware to police forces, you create a mentality where law enforcement, who are supposed to exist to protect and serve, now see their communities as being dangerous, as they see them as being the enemy, and then you have an escalation of violence in the inner cities. You have less trust between the people and the police forces and so forth. And so you have then a case turn. You actually make the problem worse, right? Now, again, just like on the harm stories, as you travel down that list of mitigate versus takeout versus case turn, it becomes more difficult to prove that story, but strategically, there is an advantage if you can prove the case turn. If you show that the affirmative plan makes the problem worse, then you are going to win because you demonstrate that the plan leads to more bad than good. Those are your 5 stock issues. The affirmative team usually needs to present all 5 of those stock issues out of the 1AC, meaning they identify a harm, a bad thing that is also significant. They identify what's causing that problem. They give us a proposed solution, which falls within the boundaries established by the debate topic, and then they show us that that solution will actually work. The negative can push back on each of those stock issues by reducing, by denying, or by showing that you actually create a problem in the process of implementing your proposal. Or in the case of topicality, the negative can say you completely missed the debate topic. Your case is outside the debate topic, and you should therefore lose the debate. You can use all of those stock issues to tell a compelling story, and also the negative can use them to make their own arguments more persuasive later on in the debate.